All right, so it is 10:30, meaning our break has ended. So if all the presenters are ready, feel free to get started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Weatherspoon. I'm a professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Agriculture, Food, and Resource Economics, also associate provost at Michigan State. Today, I'm excited to open this session on new data for policy analysis. We have 3 presenters and 2 discussants. We will have presentations, 10-minute presentations, followed by the discussants. And I would say also that it's been a joy working with this project in this consortium for the past, I guess, 7 years now. So from the beginning. And so to see this come to fruition and all the great work in this conference is a real treat. So the impact it's had, I think, is immense. So I would appreciate Aishwarya Venkat, who's a doctoral student at Tufts University, working with Will Masters, who you heard from last session. Presenting her, she'll lead with her work, and we'll follow with Lori Post and then Anwar Naseem. Aish?
Great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Let me stop my screen share here and start over. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, everything is fine.
Excellent, great. So good morning, everyone. Apologies for the tech delay here. I'm Aishwarya Venkat, and I'm a doctoral student with the Food Prices for Nutrition team at Tufts University, along with Will Masters. And I will be speaking today about our group's research on the cost and affordability of nutritious diets. So the Food Prices for Nutrition research group is focused on harnessing the explosion of data on retail food prices to measure the cost of diets around the world. And the goal of all of our work is to guide policies and programs at various scales to make diets affordable for all. So commodity prices are usually tracked to measure inflation and for consumer price indices, but the use of retail food prices, particularly for diet cost calculation, is relatively new, but it is becoming rapidly mainstreamed. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a little bit. We conceptualize diet costs as a ladder where each necessary attribute of healthy diets adds a little bit more to the total cost of the diet. So at the bottom of this ladder you see here, you'll see the cost of caloric adequacy, or just a survival diet. It consists mostly of starchy staples, maybe some oil and sugar, which are high in calories. Just above that, we have the nutrient adequate, the cost of nutrient adequacy, which includes all the macro and micronutrients needed for survival. This might include, in addition to starchy staples, some legumes, maybe some fruits and vegetables, and few animal source foods. Above that, we have the cost of the healthy diet, which is a balance of food groups as recommended by dietary guidelines. And finally, at the top of the ladder here, we have all the other factors that go into determining diets, including food preferences, time use, available equipment, tastes and preferences, and so on. So our group has published a little bit on every single tier of this ladder. Our big project last year was the cost of the healthy diet or recommended diet for the 2020 State of Food Insecurity report. Members of the group are also working on other analyses, for example, looking at seasonal fluctuations in the cost of nutrient adequacy, as well as the affordability of the Lancet diet, and most recently, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and effects of the pandemic on food prices. So the main headline from our SOFI 2020 work was that this ladder of diet costs looks very similar around the world. And the foods needed for a healthy diet have similar real costs for both rich and poor countries. So the cost of caloric adequacy, or the survival diet, comes out to about 75 cents per day. The cost of nutrient adequacy on average is about $2 a day, and the cost of recommended diet is approximately $3.50 a day. So you'll see most kind of income distributions follow the same ladder. The least cost items in each country also have fairly similar costs across income categories because individuals have the opportunity to trade. However, the variability in each of these groups tell us that the lower income countries are often outbid by higher income countries for more desirable foods, and therefore healthy diets are marginally more expensive in lower income countries. The major exception to this ladder is, of course, the high income countries, where you'll see that the jump from the the cost of nutrient adequate diets to the cost of the healthy diet is much smaller than the rest of the world. And this is primarily because of a very developed and industrialized animal source food sector, particularly dairy. This is a very capital and technology intensive sector. So in Europe and North America, the cost of dairy is much lower compared to the rest of the world. So even though prices for foods are roughly similar around the world, incomes vary greatly, which causes a lot of differences in affordability. So I know there was a question in the previous session about affordability. So here are some of the relevant analysis to that question. So we find that the total number of people who cannot afford the survival diet, the caloric adequacy diet, is about 185 million individuals. Just above that, approximately 1.5 billion people cannot afford a nutrient adequate diet, and approximately 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy, diverse diet. So this was the key takeaway from the SOFI 2020 analysis. And this finding is slightly different from some of the more established methods of tracking poverty and food insecurity around the world. But our estimates are quickly being mainstreamed as an important way of measuring progress towards the Zero Hunger Sustainable Development Goal. And most recently, the 3 billion figure was included in the outcomes of the UN Food Systems Summit, which I think you'll hear about in the 11:30 session later today. So beyond the global analysis, we've also been doing some country level analysis. So this paper by Jan Bai and colleagues looks at seasonality of the cost of nutrient adequacy in Malawi, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. And you can see from the black lines that the total cost of nutrient adequacy varies greatly throughout the year. There are periods where diets are consistently more expensive and then less expensive. And this seasonally expensive cost of nutrient adequacy is driven by seasonally high costs of animal source foods, as well as fruits and vegetables. So even though seasons are entirely predictable, people are often unable to smooth nutrition and diet costs during critical periods. This finding, of course, is very relevant for policy implications in that if we can identify critical periods when we know diets to be high, we can shape policies around that to ensure year-round nutrition and health. We are also investigating the impacts of extreme weather events on retail food prices using prices from early warning systems databases. Price movements in response to extreme events can be either supply driven or demand driven. On the supply side, quantities of both perishable and non-perishable items can actually decrease due to increased spoilage. Perhaps a storage warehouse or something is affected by floods, and high moisture conditions lead to greater spoilage, for example. On the demand side, prices can be affected by people losing wages and livelihoods due to natural disasters, and therefore being unable to purchase foods even if they are available at a market. So in this graph, the x-axis value of 0 represents the absence of the hazard, and increasing values represent increasing severity of drought conditions, flood conditions, heat waves, and storms. And the key insight from this is most of the effects that we see from extreme weather events are supply driven, but with some key exceptions. So we see that floods and droughts have opposite effects on animal source foods versus fruits and vegetables. The price per calorie of fruits and vegetables decreases during flood conditions, indicating that consumers might not be able to purchase these items either due to livelihood losses or maybe impeded access to markets. On the other hand, the prices of animal source foods reduces during drought conditions, perhaps as a result of lower incomes, again, or distressed sales of livestock, which can drive down demand for animal source foods. So these differential responses showed that disaster response programs, as well as broader climate mitigation strategies, should take into account perishability and price dynamics of different food groups to ensure diet quality, particularly in disaster recovery contexts. You heard from Jock Anderson in the previous session raising some of these issues as well. So I'm very glad to see we're moving forward towards answering those questions. We've also been studying the impacts of COVID-19 on retail food prices. So the pandemic had two key effects again. First, demand for food items went down due to lower incomes. If we can think back to maybe spring and summer of 2020 in the US, when a lot of restaurant workers and processing plant workers were laid off as companies implemented social distancing and safety guidelines, more people were also working from home. So demand for retail food went down. And in parallel, we observed that the cost of retailing went up as the labor market constricted or continues to constrict. And grocery stores and packaging plants were short-staffed due to social distancing and safety requirements. So in this graph, we can see that the dark blue line represents the global CPI for food items compared to the light blue line, which represents the overall CPI. The key insight here is that the CPI and the FCPI begin diverging actually before the pandemic, a couple of months before the pandemic picks up in full in February 2020. And the ratio of these lines, which is shown by the orange line, which is the FPI, shows that we observed a 3% rise in real food CPI since March 2020. And comparing this to the dashed red line, we can see that this difference is not driven by commodity prices. Instead, it is driven by the increase in, the increase in the cost of food retailing as a result of the pandemic. And this also closely follows, we also observe a larger rise in food prices in countries with higher COVID-19 cases, as you see from the graph on the right. There we go. So far, we've only talked about the cost of purchasing and consuming raw ingredients. We have not yet addressed the top tier of the cost ladder, which is time use, which includes time use and convenience. So the bar graph on the left here shows the average cost of purchasing 500 grams of dry beans compared to the cost of cooking this quantity of dry beans using different fuels. And we can see that the cost of the raw ingredients rivals the cost of preparation in many places, particularly Rwanda and Uganda. And so this true cost accounting work aims to move beyond simply acquisition of the raw ingredients to incorporate external costs of food preparation, including fuel, utensils, and time use. And we know that these factors are particularly important to diet cost, especially from a gender standpoint. So some conclusions from all this work. Firstly, we find that healthy diets remain unaffordable for the poorest 3 billion individuals in the world. And mitigating this will require a suite of coordinated approaches, including improving market integration to ensure that more foods are available in markets, as well as facilitating income growth and developing safety net programs to ensure that rural households have access to food during critical times of the year. At the other end of the income spectrum, we find that healthy diets are affordable, but not chosen due to various constraints based on the food environment. These may be time constraints for food preparation, food preferences, advertising, as well as marketing. So these factors have, of course, been studied individually and collectively at different scales, but the use of retail food prices as an indicator of the complete food environment is novel. And we're very encouraged to see diet cost and affordability being mainstreamed within the major development agencies. We hope that this measure is uptaken by national governments as well, so we can do or implement higher resolution monitoring of a wider range of food items. And we hope that this research can inform policies and programs to stabilize food prices and make nutritious diets affordable to all. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that interesting presentation, Ash. And we'll turn to our discussant, Stevier Kaiyatsa, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development from the Malawi. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether I should share my screen or the presentation can be beamed from that end?
You can share your screen if you would like.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, so in Malawi, well, we see that the SOFI 2020 and 2021 adopted our cost of healthy diets approach and as a way to quantify food access. So the finding that 3 billion could not afford a healthy diet become a central starting point for changes to be made after last month United Nations Food System Summit in 2021. So during the Food System Summit, there was the formation of a Healthy Diet Coalition, which has its main objective of halving the number of people who cannot afford a healthy diet while ensuring food is produced sustainably. So Malawi, being one of the countries in which this study was conducted, we do see that there are a number of opportunities through which we can adopt the cost of healthy diet approach. So for example, we have a humanitarian response program. In this program, what we do is that we estimate a number of people who are food insecure each and every year. So basically, the food insecure households are assisted with 4 items, mainly maize, legumes, oils, and soy blend. Or they may be given cash equivalent to the cost of obtaining these items. So, I mean, looking at the cost of health diet, I mean, we can integrate this so that whatever the cost of the transfer values, or as well as the food basket for these food insecure households, would reflect or increase their access to healthy diets. And then we have also social safety net programs that we're also implementing, whereby beneficiaries are paid monthly or bi-monthly on a certain amount of money. So this, however, when you look at the transfer values to these social safety net beneficiaries, does not even reflect the cost of obtaining a healthy diet. So in most cases, it's way below that cost. The same thing applies to the social protection program, the minimum wage that we have. It's barely based on overall inflation at the time, I mean, every year. So maybe the best way would be to look at, to define the minimum wage based on the diet cost of a healthy diet. Thank you so much for this. Yeah. Over.
Thank you so much for those comments on the paper. We're going to hold our questions till the end, and we'll move right on into Lori Post at Northwestern.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Can you put it in presentation mode, Lori?
You know what? I can't see my notes without it. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Practice times. I don't mind that you see them. It's okay. Thanks. Okay, so basically, I've been doing COVID surveillance since March of 2020, and I've learned several things specifically about SARS-CoV-2. I had done surveillance for over 10 years on a CDC-funded project, but SARS was really a different game. So what I wanted to be able to tell you, we can track disease and conduct surveillance, and we can identify escalations in transmissions. Here, I'm trying to change my screen here. Just a second, sorry. It's systematically, and we're doing this daily for 217 countries. So one thing that I've learned that's super important is that every outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 is preceded by a pattern of escalation, but not all escalations result in an outbreak. But it's important to note that escalations can be measured and we can identify them early on. Outbreaks can be prevented by good policy, and rarely do outbreaks or escalation of cases just fizzle out unabated. There's a few cases in Africa where this happened for some reasons we're not going to get into, but in general, you need to do something or it will just get out of control. So waiting for an outbreak to occur before reacting makes epidemics much harder to control, and it results in excess death, sickness, trauma, cost to victims in the economy, much of which is preventable. SARS-CoV-2 is here to stay. It's endemic. At this point, without significant advances in science, there's no way we should expect to be getting a SARS, booster like we would a flu vaccine every year. So our ongoing systematic surveillance and forecasting provides an early warning system and helps us to understand the impact of policy and when to implement vaccines, therapeutics, and variants of concern. And since we can identify where at an escalation is occurring, why don't we take that information and prevent the outbreak from occurring in the first place? So this is something kind of odd. I found that I've been watching the pandemic, of course, since last year. However, since the Delta variant struck, every single day, we have about 63 countries that make the list of an outbreak. But those countries are always changing, evolving. Some of them stand longer than others, some on just a short time, but it's always like 60 to 62 countries that we find out of 217 countries. And Delta has caused, more widespread and longer outbreaks than other variants. Delta's been more negative and impactful in Asian and island countries than other waves of other variants has. In general, our escalation measures signals when there's an outbreak that's likely when we're looking at cases that are between 0 and 2 per 100,000. So that means that our public health stewards can respond proactively with less invasive restrictions, such as a mandatory masking and social distancing to preserve economies and food security. If cases continue to escalate towards an outbreak, even after implementing some policies, then we need to implement more restrictive policies. They should be put in place, including up to a quarantine to prevent a full outbreak. So there are consequences to lockdowns to supply chains and economies, which is why prevention is better than reaction, and acting early on can leave economies functioning. And so I just looking at my slide here, I wanted to show you one thing that's important. I looked at 63 countries as of yesterday. This is a very up-to-date presentation. The average daily speed is 41 cases per 100,000 population. That's 4 times an outbreak. 10 per 100,000 per day is an outbreak. Today's countries in an outbreak have been in an outbreak on average for 91 days. So once you get to an outbreak, it's hard to bring it back out. On average, there were indicators of a likely outbreak for 39 days preceding the outbreak before officially surpassing the threshold of 10 cases per 100,000 population. So how do we measure epidemics and potential outbreaks? So I'm just going to preface this that, we've done a lot of metric validation, development validation, and I'm happy to share publications or details about how we do that. For purposes of brevity, I'm just going to go through those that are specific to forecasting outbreaks. The other thing that's important to remember too is that we're going to be able to use our surveillance system to do some level of disease forecasting, which is important because it's really expensive to do disease modeling. So for example, in Chicago, whenever we're having outbreaks, there are multiple studies going on at one time to prevent, how do we prevent hospitals or the healthcare system from overflowing? And each of those studies were costing about $500,000, and basically they're only as good as about 1 week after they've done the projections. So the first thing that we measure is speed, which is the basic indicator of the pandemic status on any given day, and it's the number of new cases on that day per 100,000 population. We take out the noise from that. We use a 7-day moving average because sometimes we have weekend effects where nobody reports, and we don't want to make it look like there's tons of cases on Mondays. The whole public health objective is for the speed to go down to 0 and to stay there. It would be like parking your car. Then the second measure that we use is acceleration or deceleration. We're also interested in whether the number of cases per day is increasing, peaking, or decreasing, and why. A positive acceleration indicates an increasing rate of cases per day, and a negative acceleration or deceleration indicates a decreasing rate of cases per day. An acceleration of 0 is indicative of a peak, a valley, or an inflection point, depending on, in part, on whether the previous acceleration was positive or negative. I find it's helpful to look at speed and acceleration relative to the epidemiological curve, because sometimes we'll find that we'll have a speed of or an acceleration that's at 0 when we still have a straight up and down rate of pandemic expansion. So escalation, we measure escalation by taking the square root of speed times acceleration, and that tells us when the number of new cases are escalating. Frequently, we can see a signal of an outbreak from an escalation when there's just only a few cases per day. I mean, sometimes as low as like 0.34, 0.54, whatever per day per 100,000. And a single day of measure of our escalation is based on 16 data points. So I wanted to use the example of the United States. They're a fabulous example of policies, vaccinations, and not doing anything. So surveillance, as you all know, can only monitor reported cases. So nonetheless, surveillance is an excellent proxy for monitoring the pandemic and provides tremendous value in testing policy. I think the number one question I get anytime I present is like, yeah, but what about data that's not reported, or no testing, or bias, or other types of data undercounts? We understand that surveillance takes that into account. It doesn't mean it's worthless, and it still provides is a great help. So we know that there are cases in America of SARS-CoV-2 that went back to, I think, October, November of 2019. But what happened is because the pandemic or the virus outbreak was so new, we didn't have testing or surveillance in place to actually track it till about March. And so you can see here from January through March of 2020, it's blue, and I would say that the growth is fairly negligible. It's neutral. This is about the time when the United Nations World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And then we see when we started to do testing and to track it, that we have a big escalation of cases. Escalation in cases is, the speed times acceleration. We mark it as orange. We came right up underneath the threshold of a pandemic. And then what happened in America was policies were implemented pretty much throughout the nation that required quarantine, social distancing, hand hygiene, staying at home, remote learning. We all remember the Great Shutdown. And what happened was policies work. Our surveillance shows that, because we went from the threshold of an outbreak and we were able to drive it down. And we see, there's some episodic cases where we had escalations on a day, but for the most part, it de-escalated here up until about June of 2020. Then what happens so in June 2020, I'm sorry. So basically what happened here was that policies were relaxed and we went into an outbreak. Again, we started escalating. We had several days of notice before we reached the outbreak threshold. And then we go into our first big peak of the pandemic. Then we tamped down things. Policies were tightened up, and then we see that the pandemic started to de-escalate. And then pretty much not much was done. There are new variants that came out that were more infectious and contagious, and we see that there was tremendous escalation that went almost straight up. It's more vertical than it is a curve. And then we had several peaks here. These correlated primarily with the holiday seasons and people resuming normal activities where humans were interacting with each other. And then we get to here, which is January of 2021, following the holiday season. The US peaked at its very highest, which was about 77.06 cases per day per 100,000 population. And then at this point right here, we see that the vaccination program, the mass vaccination program, was implemented, and it had a very strong effect of driving down the pandemic. And you can see the pandemic took a nosedive. Vaccinations paused a little bit, or there was not complete vaccinations. We see that eventually that the pandemic was brought below the threshold of an outbreak here at about the time, by about May of 2021, the US emerged from the outbreak nearly a year after its beginning. And then the combination of highly transmissible novel variant Delta, a sluggish vaccination program, and the general relaxation of restrictions pushed the USA back up into an outbreak in July of 2021. As you can see here, the US has remained in an outbreak for 106 consecutive days. We are on the downswing right now, but we're still at 22.14 cases per 100,000 population as measured as of yesterday. The most recent outbreak motivated more US residents to get vaccinated and or to get the booster. So we do see a decline. We hope this will come down, but we're already seeing it stalled right here. I would like Mackenzie now in my, she's going to pull up a video I wanted to show you to demonstrate the various waves of SARS-CoV-2. I have a map that signals when there's neutral growth, when there's an outbreak is likely. And for purposes of brevity, we only use 3 days per week since the pandemic began. And so it might seem a little bit choppy, but it's really interesting that you can see several times where you see escalation of cases where an outbreak is signaled, but then sometimes it will result in an outbreak and other times it will not, depending on policies. But basically, outbreaks are not a surprise. That's the big thing. And this is an opportunity in a large window of time that we can take to do something to stop an escalation of cases from reaching a full outbreak. Okay, go ahead and take it over, Mackenzie. So you can see in the blue is basically when the cases just first start popping up around the globe. It does. Orange means that we have outbreak is likely, an escalation of cases, and red means that the country is in an outbreak. And so this is not like one time that will, sweeps through the world and affects the population. We're seeing wave after wave after wave of outbreaks. It's related to policies, relaxing policies. It's related to the vaccination programs, and it's related to variants of concern. I think a really good example too is Canada oftentimes will signal that an outbreak is coming, but then they lock it down and then are able to stop a full outbreak from occurring, whereas America is not. And now we're about ready to get into the worst of the outbreak because of the holiday season and especially North, South America, Central Asia, and Europe. And about this time here, Delta shows up on the scene, but it doesn't get widely spread for another month. Now Delta is the dominant variant, and it's done a sweep throughout the whole world, meaning that most of the cases around the globe are Delta variant or sublineages of Delta. And here you see every day, but since we have Delta, 63 countries on average every day. And that is my presentation. Thank you for watching.
That's fascinating, how it spreads and goes back and forth, and the interconnectedness. Thank you for that presentation.
Yep.
Discussant for your paper isn't here. So what we'll do, I think we have time to open it up for some questions for both presentations. Right now, I see that we had a question or two for you, Venkat, and I'm not sure if you responded online or not, but I believe the question was, what would be an example of a safety net? Would that be considered a subsidy, and how can the poor countries afford to do such a thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just responded to that question, actually. So examples of safety nets that are not cash-based might include school lunch programs, voucher programs, in-kind food assistance. I was thinking of different types of insurance as well. I am not sure I'm qualified to answer how do countries afford that. I think it does require a lot of investment in kind of large scale programs. Yeah, aside from that, if anyone else wants to answer on the panel.
Thank you for that answer. So are there other questions from the audience for either presentation? Carl?
Yeah, I can't seem to ask a question on the Q&A, so I ask straight. So this is for Stevier. Are these things, these indicators and costs, are they actually being used in those programs now, or are you're considering using them in the future, or where's how much are these things actually being used?
Thank you so much, Carl. So at the moment, we are not using them, but there's a great opportunity that we can integrate them in the work that we're already doing in Malawi. Mm-hmm. But it will, of course, require some sensitization and yeah, from the policymakers.
What do you think some of the first, where are some of the first applications going to come, do you think, in Malawi?
Yeah, so I think the first one would be the determination of the transfer value for the food insecure households. That one would be the easiest thing to implement because it has funding for such programs. And then we can move on into the minimum wages and things like that, yeah.
Interesting, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. I think our discussant is arriving, virtually arriving, that is, right? And I think we have to promote him to be able to speak. So I'll introduce Chris Pratt from USAID. Hopefully we're able to add them.
He was just in and I just promoted him. I'm not sure if he didn't accept. Oh, okay, all right.
The joys of virtual conferences.
Okay. I think he's in. Perfect.
Excellent. Chris, please unmute yourself and show us yourself, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Dave. I unexpectedly find myself with you this morning. I understand that Lori has and others have presented on the fine work that they're doing, and I'm being asked to share a little bit of our perspective of that work. Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So my name is Chris Shepherd-Pratt. I, in my normal day job, work with the RFS policy group. And so I've had the benefit of working with the Rutgers Consortium and Lori and her team for a while. A few months ago, or a couple months ago, I joined the USAID COVID task force as the hotspots coordinator, leading the work for the agency in identifying hotspots and facilitating a USAID response to that. And I can say that, as I'm sure Lori has somewhat shared in her presentation, it's deeply challenging, to identify areas that are emerging, where there are emerging COVID surges. I mean, certainly we have the benefit now of 3, in some cases 4 more waves of COVID in different countries, and we can look at what that means and what it might mean for the future. But at least for the work that USAID is currently doing, we do very little to project forward, and we look more or less at the data that we have and the moment that we have and try to make sense of it and where it's going to go. And I can say that the work that Lori and her team has brought to that conversation in looking at acceleration and trends and looking at peaks and valleys in the experience that countries have been having anticipating what that might mean for a full-blown surge that exceeds the capacity of countries has been really helpful to us. Not only has it helped us to reflect on our approach and whether or not the particular indicators that we're using are sufficient to help us do that, but it's also helped us gain some insight into what's happened around the world, not just in Feed the Future countries, but in other countries as well. So for my part, I'd really like to thank Lori and her team. They've been super responsive to requests that the COVID task force has had as we are trying to wrap our heads around situations in different countries. And so, my intervention here is really to thank Lori and the team for the valuable work that they're doing and the value addition that it's provided to our own understanding. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with Lori and the team as they continue to analyze this data, reflect on new ways of using it and interpreting it based on the experiences that we're having. I think that'll just be all the more valuable as time goes on. And I'd also like to say that when I look across the landscape of people who are trying to do this work, that Lori and the team are really at the forefront there, trying to push some of the boundaries around acceleration and interpretation. So thank you. And we're looking forward to continuing to do that. Over.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, for those words. And to our final presentation is by Anwar Naseem, who, along with Carl, has led this consortium from the beginning, I believe. It's been a while, so we've been doing some great work, managing all of us, but also doing his own research. And so he's going to finish this session out with the presentation.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you. I'm going to bring the conversation back to ag transformation. And one of the tasks that we were given by USAID was to come up with indicators. And the work that Ash presented and Lori presented, and also in the sessions that follow tomorrow, we are sort of focused on our work in this area. And very early on, there was this recognition that, our notion of ag transformation needed to be a bit more holistic. And the idea, that looking at ag transformation and structural transformation through the lens of primarily, say, labor or income shares and how those things change over time wasn't enough, and just increasing sort of serial productivity wasn't enough. And that was some of the points that were there in Jim's presentation that Carl presented. So we're not suggesting that, they're not important, but we're suggesting that, we need to bring in other aspects of structural transformation that go along with, changes in labor and income. So we've all seen this graph of structural transformation. As income increases, these shares for agriculture decline, but they don't adequately capture a lot of the other things that we've been discussing, issues related to nutrition, issues related to the environment, and a whole host of other sort of attributes of the transformation process. So what we basically embarked on was this need for a broader set of indicators, and trying to understand what these indicators, what their attributes would be, and how they're related to each other. So there's one relationship issue, and if we can have some success in sort of understanding some causal effects, then we can make progress on the policy side in sort of identifying policy levers which will lead to the type of structural transformation that we want to see, which is, again, more holistic in many respects. And also, sort of benchmarking what a successful transformation should look like, and having these indicators would help us. So again, we We all believe in evidence-based policymaking, and data underlies that. The issue becomes what that data should be. So our sort of contribution has been, and I forgot to mention, there are many people involved in this effort. In the opening slide, there were a lot of names there. So this is a very consortium-wide effort, and many individuals have participated. In what we did early on was to identify some of these indicators, and I'll go through a sampling of it. You know, it'll take me a while to go through every single one of them and how our approach has been. And then we tried to say, well, okay, it's not enough to just have indicators. We have to maybe perhaps think about some sort of a composite indicator and see, you know, whether that is capturing the type of things that we wanted to capture, and then find that relationship with other attributes. And then more recent work in the last year, especially with Eric Riley, has been to look at this notion of self-reliance. So USAID, in its, you know, in the previous administration, had a concept of journey to self-reliance, this idea that countries should be more self-reliant in terms of funding their development, and in that the idea that development is self-reliant. So they had a whole set of indicators on that, and we want to see, well, what moves those indicators, especially on the ag side. So our work has been mostly, you know, looking at the macro indicators, although the work that Chuck Moss and Zamba and Baye have done in Senegal are also looking at the household level as well. But what I'm presenting here is mostly at the national level indicators. So we're trying to find indicators that are sort of comparable and they're sort of related to ag transformation, comparable across time and countries, and obviously they're available and easily available that we can use. So we go through a host of attributes that we want to see how they change over the course of agriculture transformation, and I list a few of these here at the bottom. And then we go out and identify, well, what these indicators are and how, again, finding whether there are relationships that can be looked into. So I'll just give you one example of this. So, for example, with the employment, you know, we're not just interested in agriculture or production agriculture. We want to look at the whole ag food sector, and that implies developing or coming up with an indicator that encompasses these variety of things that happen along the value chain, from the ag input supplier, from what happens on the farm, to processing, to transport and logistics, to food services. So what is, you know, what is the employment share when you look at, say, the whole ag food sector? Because a lot of times, you know, we sort of, if anybody's ever taught an ag development course, we emphasize that even though ag share of employment might be going down, that doesn't mean that ag isn't important anymore, or that it can't be an instigator for the development process. So again, we go out, we list the types of data that are available, and we identify those, and then we you know, construct various you know, these relationships. So here, for example, we look at the food processing share, just the food processing share of employment. Well, no, the whole ag food sector, including food processing. And what we find is, for example, that the share of employment in this sector increases with higher income. So again, while the ag production is going down, the ag share in food processing is increasing. Another example we did is with productivity, looking at various indicators of productivity, both, you know, land productivity, labor productivity, total factor productivity, and then trying to understand, well, what's going on in various countries. So you can contrast this very simple relationships. Well, you can look at a successful country and a country that may not be characterized as being very successful, and what their labor productivity has been. And this on the slide on the right side, which says the title "Labor Productivity in Ag versus Non-Ag," where this is from work that Will Masters has done, basically showing that the productivity, labor productivity relative to non-ag productivity in Africa is much lower than say the rest of the world, especially the richer countries. So we try to understand these types of changes over time and using some of these indicators that we have developed. The next part that I really want to quickly go through is trying to understand, well, can we sort of take all those various aspects of ag transformation and condense it into some sort of an index and see whether that is capturing the types of things that we would like to capture. And we do that here. We have a paper on this. It hasn't been published. It's a working paper on the website, basically looking at developing an index and doing some sort of factor analysis to see which of this can be sort of condensed into a single index and do some sort of descriptive and regression analysis. So using that particular index, we want to see here, well, how have countries evolved in terms of their transformation, this particular transformation. So the abbreviation of Contemporary Ag Transformation Index is CATI here. So basically we're in this graph, we're showing the level in 1995 and 2005. And if you're below the line, the 45-degree line, then the country hasn't really transformed as much according to this index. And many African countries, as you can see, are below the line, whereas most countries in Asia are above. So again, it's perhaps we know this, but we can, even with this sort of more holistic nature of the index, we find the same same sort of result. Then we do some sort of a regression analysis using this as a dependent variable and trying to see whether it is related to various aspects of structural transformation and ag transformation. Again, I'm sorry I'm going through this quickly in the interest of time. Basically, we find that these are sort of preliminary results that there's investments in the ag sector seem to have some change in this particular index, such as provision of sort of rural utilities as proxied by, say, sanitation and water availability. And finally, where I want to end on is our work on the self-reliance indicators and their relationship to ag transformation. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of speed through this. Basically, the idea that so USAID had this concept of self-reliance. I mean, it's still there, but now they've sort of changed the name to roadmaps. But the idea being that countries need to be at a state where that they are sort of owners of their own development process, if you will. And then they have various metrics to measure this. So they have two types of metrics here: commitment metric and capacity, and various sort of indicators go within that. So within commitment, there are 7 indicators, and capacity has 10. So again, the idea being that, how committed countries are to their development process, and do they have the capacity to do that. And what we want to do here is basically to understand what these policies are, how policies can contribute to that. So we spent a whole lot of effort in trying to make a time series of this, because the right now the way it's presented, we only have 3 years, so we constructed a time series. It's supposed to replicate the commitment and capacity indicators, but what we find is that when you do that over time period, we do some principal component analysis. So a lot of the variance can be explained by 1 or 2 key variables. For the capacity, it's GDP, and for commitment, say environmental policy and open government. And then we combine all the various indicators, the commitment and capacity indicators, into one, and then see whether one of those explains most of it. And again, one dimension does explain 51% of all the variance. So I'm sort of ending this with the question, well, what is the relationship of the contemporary ag transformation and self-reliance objectives? And that is the question that we are in the process of sort of doing some sort of statistical analysis, but sort of on a graphical level, if we sort of plot the value added of agriculture against the capacity indicator and the commitment indicator. So these two graphs are simply by country groups and by income groups, and you get a very distinct differentiation by income group. So that means that maybe there's something there in terms of getting agriculture moving and getting these capacity improvements in capacity and commitment indicators.
Anwar, I'm not sure how many more slides you have.
Okay, I think I'll end there. I'm sorry. So yeah. Sorry, yeah, I was running late. Okay.
No, well, thank you. And please, if you have any questions, please post your questions either in chat or the question and answer session for any of the guests. I guess I will ask while I'm waiting for questions to show up. Anwar, you mentioned this multidimensional measure, and I think that's on the right track because a lot of these things are cumulative, right? There's some kind of fulcrum here. And so when you think about nutrition, and I noticed that you brought into your last set of slides, but not in the very beginning, your first mention of multidimensional measures. How does that factor in? Does it weigh in pretty heavy in terms of thinking about transformation and self-reliance? And how do you bring that in?
Not in the index per se, but that's something that we could bring it. I mean, we're trying to understand, expanding the more traditional notion of ag transformation that did include labor and income shares, and then seeing how, what is that relationship with sort of nutritional transition? And I know Will Masters has done a lot of work on sort of looking at the relationship between ag transformation and nutritional transition.
I don't see another question just yet. Is there any comments that Lori or Venkat would like to make as a final statement?
Well, Dave, maybe we should stop here, and it'll allow us to get on to the next section. If nobody has any objections.
No, thanks, Dave, for the great intro and the great monitoring.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Take
We'll
care.
now move on to UN Food System Summit. And Tom Reardon's